Here we are with part 2 of Why Are We the Only Species of Human on the Planet? In this part we will continue right from there we stop in part 1. In the last part we were trying to understand the question that why we don't have any sister species. Without any further delay we are staring. Let's go. We are the only species of Homo the genus that we're in that is currently on the planet, so then maybe there's not a problem here because maybe actually we have always been alone. Perhaps Homo came into existence, and we have been a solitary species essentially for all of our history. This question or this suggestion was not problematic for most of human history because for most of human history the predominant rhetoric has been one of creation myths of religion. To get knowledge of every religion's myth on human creation you can check out our series of human creation myths. In that series 1 tried to cover all religions' creation myths one by one. You can check one myth in one video. To keep track of the channel please subscribe to the channel and press the bell icon. Coming back to the topic. The idea that humans were created as a species to have domination over all other species. So, it would make sense in that particular view that we were alone because if you're going to create a species to dominate all the other ones, you probably wouldn't create two because that's going to be problematic and so up until sort of the 1700s. This was not a particular issue, however, as Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection took hold and people started to really understand this principle they began to question more and more. This idea is about why humans should be so different to everything else. If species arise by natural selection by diversification, then why should human species be anything different to anybody else? Why haven't we diversified? Why don't we have these sibling species? And this problem was kind of rumbling around, particularly in the more learned, more kind of liberal Victorian society at the time. People started to ask questions about some of the artifacts that had previously been reported, particularly from mining expeditions, and so actually for many decades people live in for stone for buildings, for example, had occasionally stumbled across weird and wonderful things that we would now call fossils or archival material. These were animals, often they were animals, but frequently they came across things that looked pretty human, for example like a skull dug out of a quarry in Jolter in the early 1800s. When they'd done that, these were typically described by the scientific community at least as archaic humans, so they were humans that have been around for a long time. There was also sort of interesting and slightly amusing and quite disturbing in some ways. If you like, in these things were associated with crazy myths, so people say they're extinct giants or they were kind of mythological 12-headed beasts or something else. There was a kind of roaring circus trade in demonstrating bits of scary monsters that came out of queries. However, now we know scientifically that was not true, so these things had been found for a period of time but had always been attributed to Homo sapiens. People would say these are old archaic long-dead humans, and then in 1856 this part of skull was found in Germany in the Neander Valley and was successfully identified by a German schoolteacher as being distinct enough from Homo sapiens to be a different species, and this is the species that we now know as Neanderthals. Once that view had been promoted that this was a different lineage of humanity, people went back and looked at other material including this skull from Jolter and realized that this skull was actually much more similar to this Neanderthal skull than to modern humans, and so actually much of the fossil material that had previously been identified was now realized to be Neanderthal material rather than human material. This is also sort of going on in the context at the same time, for example as Darwin was publishing his book On the Origin of Species was kind of entering this sort of very intellectual debate around diversification about evolution of humans. It didn't really change our view about humans being a kind of solitary species in existence. However, in 1891 Eugene Duis, who was a Dutch anatomist, was working in what was then the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia. He was particularly interested in some of the remains being found in caves as people pushed on up, and particularly the logging industry as they started to roam into the rainforest would sometimes come across caves with bone remnants. He started to collect some of these and classify them together and realized that one collection of skeleton material belonged to something that looked very human-like. He actually misidentified this and thought this was an extinct species of great ape, gave it a different name and published it. But people, once it was sent back to Europe, did not agree with this and relatively rapidly realized that this was a second example of a distinct species of a now extinct human-like organism. So, within the genus Homo, and this is what we now know of as Homo erectus, a long-extinct ancestor of modern humans. There's now fossil material from many other locations around the world, so now as we at the end of the 1800s, we have a position where there are at least two species of Homo sapiens and Neanderthals and what is now Homo erectus that we think have existed and no longer do exist. The world is starting to view the fact that we perhaps haven't always been alone through quite a different lens, and then this third piece of the puzzle. If You Like comes around in 1907 with Otto Skak, and he was a German industrialist, and I really like this story because he was actually, as a relatively young man, he was a chemist and he set up factories producing chemicals essentially and made an awful lot of money. He was essentially an industrial entrepreneur, and rather than buying himself a fancy yacht or something and sailing around the world, he decided to invest his money in a proper education. He went back to university and studied what was then known as a degree in prehistory, what we now call anthropology or something like that, and used his money to fund investigations into the evolution of humans. In particular, what he would do was offer a reward to people who were working in quarries in Germany if they came up with any interesting material. They would bring it to him, and he would pay them for it. And in 1907 the Ma quarry, someone came to Otto with this rather spectacular jawbone, and also in his newly found life as a paleontologist correctly identified this as another species of Homo and another extinct one. This is what we now know of as Homo heidelbergensis, named by him at the time, was the first really well accepted totally distinct species of human. Since 1907 we've obviously had a massive explosion in activities, particularly in the last 20 or 30 years actually, in the discovery of both fossil material and artifacts associated with humans. This is an incredibly fast-moving field. We now know that there are many species of now extinct Homo that have existed in parallel on the planet at the same time for a large period of our history, but are no longer present with us today. As far as we know, Homo sapiens is the only one of these to still be present. So why might that be? What has happened to drive this colonization of Homo sapiens around the world and to remove these other species? Why is it that we don't go to the supermarket and bump into a Homo heidelbergensis? And to think about that in a bit more detail, we have to think about what our most recent parallel species were like and why therefore they may no longer be around now. So as far as we know at the moment, and as I say, this is undoubtedly subject to change, and I suspect very soon we'll have to revise this. But as we know at the moment, there are at least 4 parallel species of Homo-like organism. So, like ourselves, that have coexisted in relatively recent evolutionary history, and by relatively recent means the last 100,000 years or so. There are cells. This is Homo sapiens and looks like a very familiar skeleton, and then the species about which we know the most by far are these chaps and the Neanderthals. In many ways very similar skeleton, looks very similar, same sorts of bones, much chunkier. The bones are thicker, so the whole body is more well developed, and some subtle differences are particularly around the skull. People say you can tell whether you're a Neanderthals or a Homo sapiens by standing in the rain. So if you're out standing in the rain and the rain is forming a nice sheet in front of your eyes because it's dripping off your brow ridge, then you're probably Neanderthal and you should check in the mirror. If it's running down your face and dripping off your chin, then you're probably a Homo sapiens. You can go home safely in the knowledge of the correct species because Neanderthal had a very prominent brow ridge and a receding chin. We have negligible brow ridge and a protruding chin, so you can check your chin if you want to make sure you are the correct species. If not, please subscribe to my channel to identify in shorter time. So, we know a lot about the Neanderthal. We have a lot of fossil material, and we have a lot of associated artifacts with their life. We also have genetic information that we also have a little chap here. This is Homo floresiensis. We know far less about this species for 2 reasons really. First of all, it was only discovered in 2003, and second of all, we have only found it on the island of Flores in Indonesia and nowhere else, and people with good memories might remember the kind of media flurry around. This is often referred to as the Hobbit because it's very small. In fact, Homo fens probably top out at about a meter tall. It was a very diminutive species of Homo, and people actually argue still a lot about where it fits. It has some characteristics that look very ancestral, much more like some human precursors. If you like that, we're living perhaps 6 million years ago, but in other features it looks relatively modern, much more like Homo sapiens, and it's a little bit unclear about the lineage of this. There's also relatively little fossil material from this species, and there have been some difficulties in studying it. The position of floresiensis in the kind of family tree is debated, however the dating is pretty good. We know that this chap was running around on the island of Flores at the time that Homo sapiens, modern Homo sapiens, was elsewhere in the world. It's certainly contemporary in time, even if it wasn't contemporary in geography. There are some other our close extinct relatives. Be with me for the part to get that notification. Please subscribe to my channel and press the bell icon. I am working on the next part. Meanwhile, you can check other interesting stuff like animal domestication series, and you come to know there is one animal who domesticated itself, not by us. Thanks for watching.